you, and we are honored to welcome Sir Rupert Sheldrake with us, who would be giving his lecture on the topic Morphic Resonance Theory and Discussion. Rupert Sheldrake, sir, is a biologist and an author of more than 100 scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals and 9 books, including The Presence of the Past. His books have been published in 28 languages. He was among the top 100 global thought leaders for 2013. On ResearchGate, his research interest score puts him in the top 4% of scientists. He studied natural sciences at Cambridge University, where he was a scholar of Clare College, took a double first class honours degree, and was awarded the University Botany Prize. He then studied philosophy and history of science at Harvard University, where he was a Frank Knox Fellow. Before returning to Cambridge, where he took a PhD in biochemistry, he was a Fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, where he was Director of Studies in Biochemistry and Cell Biology. He was also a Research Fellow of the Royal Society. From 1974 to 1985, he worked in India as Principal Plant Physiologist and as a consultant at International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics in Hyderabad. From 2005 to 2010, he was director of Parrot Warwick Project for the study of unexplained human and animal abilities, funded from Trinity College, Cambridge. He is currently a fellow of National He is currently a fellow of Institute of Neotech Sciences in California and of Temenos Academy in London. For 12 years running, he has been recognized as one of the most spiritually influential living people in the world by Watkins Mind Body Spirit magazine. His work has been featured in many magazines, newspapers, and broadcast media, including New Scientist, The Guardian, Discover Magazine, The Spectator, The Washington Post, and on BBC Radio and television. We are very grateful to have you today with us, sir, and we look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And first, let me apologize for my absence last time I was supposed to be talking. I muddled up the time zone difference. Anyway, here I am. And what I'm going to do is give a summary of the ideas of morphic resonance. I know that some of you have done my online course, and I've received a particularly intelligent and interesting set of questions. So what I'm going to do is summarize the ideas for the benefit of those who haven't done the course already. And also I'm going to weave in some of the answers to the questions that came to me. So first of all, morphic resonance is basically the idea there's an inherent memory in nature, that all of nature has a kind of memory, that the so-called laws of nature are actually more like habits, depending on what's happened before. Each species has a kind of collective memory. Every individual contributes to it and in turn draws upon it. And perhaps the most provocative and controversial aspect of this hypothesis is the idea that our own memories, our ordinary memories, how we remember what we did yesterday, all the things we've learned, all that kind of thing, and the skills we've learned, that these memories are not stored inside our brains, which is the usual assumption, but instead they're given by morphic resonance. Well, the basis of this whole hypothesis is the principle of morphic resonance, which is the idea that things resonate across time and space with similar things in the past. And by things, I mean resonant patterns of activity. Everything in nature that's self-organizing has resonant activity. Nuclei in atoms have resonant frequencies. That's why you can have nuclear magnetic resonance technologies used in medicine. The electrons have resonance. You can have electron spin resonance techniques. The whole vibratory activity of the electrons as they in their orbitals around the nucleus constitutes the atom, which is a vibratory system. Molecules are vibratory systems. They have electronic orbitals. They have vibratory patterns of the electrons as well as the nuclei within the molecules. And things like protein molecules have oscillation or vibratory patterns. Cells have rhythms, organisms have rhythms. We ourselves have many rhythms. We have daily rhythms of waking and sleeping. We have brainwave rhythms. We have heartbeats. We have breathing rhythms. We have very rapid biochemical rhythms going on within us, and so on. What I'm not suggesting that each system has a single frequency, like 327 hertz. I'm suggesting that each system is a complex pattern, a structure of resonances in space and time. And this whole pattern is what resonates across time. So something that's very similar to something that's happened in the past will tune in to all those past instances and pick up a kind of memory from them. Well, that's the hypothesis in a nutshell. And this is a testable scientific hypothesis. It's not a metaphysical system. It's not a philosophical theory. It's a scientific hypothesis that can be tested by experiment. And it has already been tested by experiment, not very much so far. But what I'll do now is go through some of the ways in which it can be tested. Well, first of all, take quantum theory. In quantum theory, we already have the idea of quantum entanglement, which is where particles that have been part of the same system can remain connected even if they whiz apart at the speed of light. They remain connected or entangled, so that a change in one is instantaneously associated with a change in the other across space. Well, quantum entanglement is in some ways similar to morphic resonance, but it's essentially about entanglement in space. Whereas morphic resonance is about entanglement in time. It's not based on the being the same system, it's being based on a different system, but similar to things that have gone before. And quantum particles themselves should be subject to morphic resonance. An electron, a proton, for example, would have morphic resonance from all past electrons and all past protons. And there have been so many past electrons and so many past protons over billions of years that this morphic resonance doesn't really change much anymore with time. It reaches a kind of limit. I mean, you've had trillions, quadrillions, gazillions of previous ones. You won't notice much difference between today and tomorrow. There's a huge background resonance. And most things in physical nature have an enormous background morphic resonance that makes them behave as if they're obeying eternal laws, which is the standard assumption of science. It's as if there are eternal laws that are outside space and time that govern everything. Well, in the case of very long established systems, you probably wouldn't notice much difference. This hypothesis is not testable with very long established systems. It is testable with new systems that have never occurred before, because when a new system comes into being and when it's repeated, it should get easier and easier for it to happen, and it should be possible to notice this experimentally. Now, in quantum physics, there are whole areas which probably are new in the whole of nature, in the whole of the universe. One category are Bose-Einstein condensates. The background temperature of the universe, of the cosmic microwave background radiation, is about 2.7 degrees Kelvin. But in low temperature physics labs, you can go down to 0.1 of a degree Kelvin or less. And at these very low temperatures, material systems behave in a very unusual way. They form Bose-Einstein condensates, where all the electrons behave as if they're a single system. They're superfluid, superconductive, frictionless. And I think these may be examples of new morphic fields coming into being. And if that's so, then if people who make these condensates made them repeatedly, it should get easier to make them. They should appear either more rapidly or at higher temperatures than they did before. so this theory is testable in the realm of quantum physics. It may also be testable in the realm of materials science. I think one of the most creative areas of science at the moment is material science and solid-state physics. I read Nature every week, and the papers that seem to me the most exciting are these ones with remarkable new states of matter, twisted graphite layers, for example, new superconducting properties. Now, some of these emergent holistic properties may well represent new morphic fields being subject to morphic resonance, and therefore morphic resonance might be detectable in material science labs. It may be that people actually doing these experiments have already noticed it without noticing it. Most people in labs assume that everything is governed by timeless laws, and therefore any repetition should be the same as any previous example of the experiment. They don't take into account possible changes over time and don't look for them. But it may be that in people's lab notebooks, in various materials science or solid state physics or low temperature physics labs, people may already have data that suggests changes over time. When people do notice these, which they sometimes do, they usually assume that it's not nature that's changing, but them. They assume they're just getting better at doing the experiment, and that's why the results are improving. Uh, well, obviously that's a possibility. We do get better with practice. But what I'm suggesting is this may be happening not just as a matter of people getting better at it, but because there's a real change in the systems under investigation because of morphic resonance from similar systems in the past. This hypothesis is also testable in the realm of chemistry. Chemists make new molecules every year. Thousands of new molecules are made in drug companies, in universities, and in research institutes. And I'm suggesting that each time a new molecule comes into being, it's a new morphic field. Ones that have existed in nature for many years, things like sucrose or glucose or the amino acid glycine and so on, these have been around for millions, billions of years. We wouldn't expect to see much change in their properties, but again, it's the new compounds where we can see this. And we see it not only, I think, with chemical molecules, but with the crystals they form. When a chemist makes a new molecule for the first time and crystallizes it, there hasn't been a crystal of that form before. It's not existed, as far as we know, anywhere in the universe. And it may take a long time for the crystal to form. It often does. But once it's formed in one place, what I'm suggesting is it should form more easily all over the world. And chemicals should get easier to crystallize. And actually, there's a huge amount of anecdotal evidence from chemistry that this actually happens. There are many examples of compounds that couldn't be crystallized. When they are crystallized, suddenly the crystals turn up all over the world. Now, chemists themselves are aware of this, but they don't usually explain it in terms of morphic resonance, largely because traditionally they'd never heard of morphic resonance. They just assume it must be because of fragments of previous crystals spreading around the world as dust particles and settling out in laboratories all around the world. What I'm suggesting is these changes should occur even when dust particles are filtered out. Perhaps even easier test in chemistry is with melting points. There's a tendency for the melting points of new compounds to go up. Now, you all know that melting points are supposed to be constants, and you can look them up in handbooks of physical constants. And at any given time, there's the value of the melting point. It looks like a constant. But if you look at melting points over time, it turns out that for new synthetic compounds, the melting points, generally speaking, go up. In a study conducted by Dr. Klaus Orr, a Canadian chemist, he looked through the records for synthetic organic chemicals. He looked at 147 chemicals and looked at the history of their melting points. And he found that over several decades, 139 had gone up and 8 had gone down. Now, if it was just random error, you'd expect just as many to go up as to go down. But this is a hugely significant number. It's billions to one against chance that they're going up much more than they're going down. Again, chemists are often aware of this, but they explain it away because it doesn't fit the standard theory. They just say, oh, well, we're just getting better at making the compounds, and impurities lower the melting point, so later samples must be purer. That's why the melting points have gone up. I sometimes ask chemists, how do you know the later samples are purer? And they say, well, they must be purer because the melting points have gone up. So you see, that's a circular argument. This, however, makes it possible to test for morphic resonance by doing deliberate tests. One way of doing it is to look at chemicals that occur in nature and have crystallized in nature for millions or billions of years, and compare them with newly synthesized chemicals. We wouldn't expect to see a change in the ones that have been around for billions of years because there's so much background resonance. No small increment of new resonance would make a noticeable difference. But with new compounds, we would expect to see those changes. And I've done a number of comparisons. For example, salicin is a compound that occurs in the bark of willow trees and crystallizes in nature. And the melting point of salicin has not changed in the last 100 years. But a synthetic derivative, acetyl salicylic acid, or aspirin, first synthesized in the 19th century in Germany, has shown increases in melting point over the 20th century. I haven't got the data from the 19th century. They'd probably be bigger if we could include all those data, but 8 or 10 degrees. Many of the changes that Klaus Orr detected were not fractions of a degree. They were 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 10, 20, sometimes 30 degrees centigrade. So we're talking about quite big changes. And here's something, again, where specific tests could be done. Say you made 10 new chemicals, measure their melting points of the crystals, then pick one of them at random, make large quantities of it and crystallize it, and then go back to the original 10 samples and test their melting points. The one that you've now made a lot of should have gone up, and the other should have stayed more or less the same. They act as controls. Now, no one's actually done this simple experiment yet, but it would be a very simple way of looking for morphic resonance in the realm of chemistry and crystallography. Now, morphic resonance also, of course, applies to living organisms, and here it's possible to do many experiments. There's one I'm doing myself at present in a laboratory in the north of England, which is on the evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. It's well known that bacteria can develop resistance to antibiotics when exposed to increasingly higher levels of antibiotic. And this is partly a matter of mutations, natural selection of mutations in a standard Darwinian way. Partly it's epigenetic effects, which are not changes in the genes themselves, but changes in the way the genes are expressed, some of which can be inherited and give hereditary effects which are non-genetic. That's why they're called epigenetic. Now, I'm doing experiments on the evolution of antibiotic resistance in E. coli, looking at the rate at which the resistance develops by subculturing into successively higher concentrations of antibiotic. That's what's happening as I speak. The next experiment, which will be happening in a few weeks' time, will involve starting with a fresh batch of E. coli, identical to the starting batch the first time, and doing the same experiment again, exactly the same experiment again, under exactly the same conditions. And what morphic resonance would predict is that this evolutionary process occurs quicker, that it happens faster as a result of morphic resonance from the first evolutionary process. And this, you see, is over and above epigenetic effects. There are epigenetic effects in inheritance, but morphic resonance is over and above those effects. And this experiment, because it starts with a fresh batch of bacteria, would see whether we start from the same point, the changes happen faster, which would be evidence for morphic resonance. It would also be relevant to the evolution of resistance to antibiotics in the world. It's well known that this happens, and it's a threat to human survival, really, because if we run out of antibiotics, a lot of infectious diseases will return with a vengeance. And it's well known that antibiotic resistance can evolve independently in different parts of the world in a way that some epidemiologists have described as mysterious. I think actually it's because of morphic resonance, and this experiment should shed light on that. Then it's possible to test for morphic resonance in biological morphogenesis. And in my book, The Presence of the Past, I describe experiments with fruit flies that have been done here in Britain. And what these experiments show is that if you expose the eggs of fruit flies to a chemical that leads to abnormal development, in this case diethyl ether, the fruit flies develop 4 wings instead of 2. In the first generation, 2% developed abnormally, the next generation, 5%, and it went up to about 30% over 10 generations. This abnormal development of 4-winged instead of 2-winged flies is not a genetic effect. It's not because of mutations, it's because of interfering with morphogenesis by the chemical. A little bit like the chemical thalidomide disastrously interfered with human embryology when it was prescribed to pregnant women. The deformed children that were born were not deformed because of genetic mutations, but because of disturbances to the development process. Well, it's already known that this happens with fruit flies, and that could be an epigenetic effect. It's not a genetic effect, it could be epigenetics. But the way to distinguish between epigenetics and morphic resonance is to start with a fresh batch of fruit flies that had never been exposed to the ether before and see what happens. And in fact, this has been done. And whereas the first time 2% became abnormal, the second time, starting afresh with a fresh batch of fruit flies, 5% became abnormal. The first time in the second generation, 5% became abnormal. In the second time, 10% became abnormal. So the effect was much bigger. And this was nothing to do with epigenetics because there's no hereditary connection between the new batch of fruit flies and the ones that had previously been exposed to the ether, which caused the abnormal development. So in many epigenetic experiments, I think people ought to include a morphic resonance control, which are organisms that generation after generation have not been treated with the chemical that's leading to the epigenetic effects or the unusual environment over the generations, but just a control line and see if those change with time as well. I can illustrate that principle with experiments on animal learning. Those of you who's done my course will know about the experiment on rat learning by McDougall and then by Crew and by Agar, which were conducted years ago, starting at Harvard. The rats were trained to escape from a water maze, and in subsequent generations, on average, they got quicker and quicker at learning how to escape from this maze. And that could have been an epigenetic effect. But when this was repeated by Agar in Melbourne, Australia, and his colleagues, what they found was that this improvement over the generations was not confined to rats descended from trained rats. They had a control line of rats, none of which had ever been exposed to the water maze, no previous generations. But when they tested for the control line, over time, they were also getting better in the same way as the ones that had descended from trained parents. Now, if it was being epigenetic, only passed on through sperm and eggs, this should not have happened. If it was morphic resonance, then it would happen, and it did happen. So here are ways in which it's possible to distinguish between epigenetic effects and morphic resonance effects. Another way of distinguishing with them is an experiment I did with Stephen Rose at the Open University here in England with day-old chicks. Day-old chicks were trained to become averse to a yellow light-emitting diode. They peck at any moving object, day-old chicks. And there was a control, a chrome bead they pecked at, and nothing happened after that. But if they pecked the yellow light-emitting diode, then they were made sick by an injection of lithium chloride, which makes them mildly sick. And after that, they'd never peck the yellow light again. This is a well-known form of condition. It's aversive conditioning. In this experiment, a fresh batch of day-old chicks was tested every day. They were not descended from ones that had been tested before. They were completely fresh chicks. And what happened was that relative to pecking at the chrome bead, the control, they became more and more averse to pecking at the yellow light. As time went on, their reluctance to peck at it increased, and it took longer and longer before they pecked at it, if they pecked at all. And here again, this could not be an epigenetic effect. It's a morphic resonance effect. Well, this theory can also be tested in the realm of human learning, and it has been tested with a number of new skills. One of them, like solving crossword puzzles. It should be easier to solve the London Times crossword puzzle tomorrow than today, because so many people will have solved today's crossword by tomorrow. It should make it easier. A lot of people have spontaneously noticed this, and some experiments have suggested this really is the case. It would be possible to develop really good morphic resonance tests using video games, because playing video games involves coordination skills. And if there were a new video game involving a new set of skills, the prediction is that it should get easier and easier for people to learn this game over time. There's already evidence from video game developers. There was one called, I think it was called Band. It was about making particular music videos. It involved a kind of puzzle element. And the people who put this game on the market found that people were learning these puzzles much too quickly after a certain amount of time. They had to make it harder. And then that got easier too, and they had to make it harder again. So if one set up a special video game experiment, one would obviously not put it online, so lots of people would learn it all over the world. You'd have a subpopulation that learned this skill in a particular place, and then you test people in other places who'd never seen it before and see whether they learned it quicker. You test some before and after it was learned in the first place. Does it get easier elsewhere? So there are plenty of opportunities using new technologies for testing morphic resonance, and some of them could even be built into commercial video game systems. I'm developing an idea at the moment for auditory memory tests that could be done as part of video games online that would not be subject to cheating or learning and could give massive participation in morphic resonance research. This hypothesis leads to a new interpretation of inheritance. We've all been brought up with the idea that inheritance is primarily based on genes or the genetic code. I think genes have been grossly overrated. What genes actually do is code for the sequence of amino acids in proteins, and some are involved in switching on or switching off other genes. What they don't do is code for the shape of your face or the pattern of of peacock feathers, on the pattern on the peacock feathers, or the patterns on a butterfly wing, or the forms of your foot or your arm, or the forms of flowers or leaves. They code for the proteins that go into all these structures, But I think that what codes for the shape, the form of these things, is a morphic field. It's through these morphic fields that morphic resonance works. And the word morphe, of course, means form in Greek. So morphic resonance is about resonance of form or pattern. And nature is full of forms, and morphic resonance applies to forms and to the inheritance of forms, both the obvious form or shape of an animal or plant, but also the instincts of animals, the forms of behavior that they have, like the ability of a young spider to spin a web without having to go to a web school or having to be trained by a master web spinner. They can just do it. They know how to make a wonderfully complex orb web just by instinct. And that, I think, is largely morphic resonance. If it had defective genes that gave defective web protein, then obviously the web would be defective. And it's obviously influenced by genes, but the form is inherited by morphic resonance. And when people were in the 1980s and 90s convinced that genes would explain all inheritance, a huge amount of money and effort was put into the Human Genome Project and to other genome projects. People, in retrospect, naively believed that they understand human nature at the molecular level by just knowing the sequence of genes. Uh, well, when the genome was actually successfully sequenced, it turned out that there were only about 20,000 genes that were in humans. About I think a rice plant has about 55,000, so we've got less than a plant, uh, and less than many other animals. So that was a shock. People thought there'd be 100,000 genes. There weren't. And then people thought they'd be able to predict all sorts of details, people's proneness to schizophrenia, to breast cancer, and so on, just by analyzing their genes. But genome-wide association studies comparing the genomes of tens of thousands of people have shown that this is simply not possible. You can predict schizophrenia with an accuracy of about 2.5%, not 90% as people hoped, and breast cancer with about 10%. Even height, you can't explain more than about 20%, which means most of the inheritance of these things, which are known to have a large hereditary component, is not explained by genes. And this is now called the missing heritability problem. I think the reason there's a missing heritability problem is that genes were never coding for most of these things in the first place. They do code for proteins. Some rare genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis have a simple genetic explanation. One gene change can lead to this disease. CRISPR gene editing can solve that problem if the technical problems can be overcome. But most heredity is not like that. And so I think morphic resonance leads to a completely new interpretation of inheritance. It also, as I mentioned at the beginning, leads to a completely new interpretation of regular memory. The standard assumption within neuroscience is that memories are stored in the brain as memory traces. Some physical, material change happens in the brain, which is how memory is stored. Well, people have spent more than 100 years trying to localize and find these memory traces, modified synapses, special proteins, even changes in DNA or RNA have been proposed. And they've failed. Over and over again, people have found regions of the brain involved in learning. They assume they're part of the memory system. And then a day or two later, if you cut out those bits that they've identified as the memory center, uh, the animal still remembers what it's learned. So then they say, well, the memory must be spread out all over the brain or stored holographically, which makes it very hard to detect it anywhere. One researcher said it seems to be everywhere and nowhere in particular. There's a real problem about memory trace theory. Recent research with new techniques involving very fine electrodes, multiple electrode arrays in the brains of rodents, like mice, has shown that when they learn something, there's a complex pattern of waves goes through their brain, a distinctive pattern about learning a particular skill. And when repeat that skill, you get a very similar pattern of waves in the brain. And at first people thought, oh, here we are, we've detected the wave pattern. That's the characteristic that must be stored in those cells showing the waves. But when they looked in more detail, what they found was that the wave pattern remained the same when they remembered this thing, but the exact place in the brain shifted. It moved from different regions of the brain. It wasn't always in the same place. And this is now called representational drift, a drift of the wave pattern that shows that's associated with the memory. Now, if the memory is stored in actual physical traces in the brain, that shouldn't happen. It's another big problem for memory trace theory. But if memory depends on morphic resonance, it's not a problem. Morphic resonance depends on wave patterns, and we know the brain's full of them. It doesn't matter if they're in the same place or not. It just matters that there's the same pattern. And the reason that we have our own memories rather than other people's by morphic resonance is that morphic resonance depends on similarity. The more similar something is to what's happened before, the greater the morphic resonance. And if you think about it, and you ask yourself the question, who in the past was most like me? The answer is me. I'm more similar to me, Rupert, in the past than I am to any of you. And you're similar to yourself, more similar to yourself than to anyone else. And so that's why I think we have specific memories of ourselves by morphic resonance. The brain is more like a TV receiver than like a video recorder. I think we're also similar, of course, to other people, especially people we're closely related to, our family, and people with similar culture and background, hereditary background. So there's a kind of collective memory as well. And the psychologist Jung, the Swiss psychologist, has already a well-developed theory of human collective memory, which is more specific for people who you're more closely related to. So the idea of individual memory and collective memory is that they're different in degree, not in kind. Morphic resonance is more specific. Now, if we pick up the memory of lots of people, millions of people who are now dead, as well as the memory of people who are still alive. If for some reason you picked up the memory of a particular person who is now dead, and tuned in specifically to that person, for I don't know why, but if you could do that, then you could pick up their memories by morphic resonance. And in fact, as many of you I'm sure will know, there's now very good evidence, particularly from the work of Professor Ian Stevenson at Virginia University in the United States, that some children, young children, seem to remember previous lives in a way that has remarkable detail that can't be explained by fraud or subtle cues and so on, that shows at the very least a transfer of memory. Now, that would be quite explainable by morphic resonance. It wouldn't explain why there's this specific connection, but the very fact of memory transfer is what morphic resonance is all about. Now, whether you consider that the transfer of memory equals reincarnation, or whether you think that it's just a memory transfer, I don't know. This is actually an argument that's been going on between Buddhists and Hindus for many, many centuries. Buddhists have a rather different theory of what they call rebirth. Both theories involve the transfer of memory, but one involves the transfer of the whole personality or more unitary self than the Buddhist theory, which is more like a bundle of memories. Anyway, this is not the place to get into a discussion about these philosophical differences. My point here is simply to make the point that memory is not confined to the brain, nor is it stored in the brain. And this has important implications for any religion. All religions believe there's some kind of survival of bodily death, that something continues after death, that our consciousness or our being is not simply extinguished at death. Well, our identity depends entirely on our memories, or very largely on our memories, which is why when people have Alzheimer's disease and lose their memory, their whole personality seems to disappear. They can no longer behave in any normal way because memory is so intrinsic to our normal functioning. Now, if memories are stored in our brains, then obviously when we die, all the memories must be wiped out at death. That's the assumption of contemporary neuroscience, and that's why many Western scientists are atheists. They say, well, look, all religions must be false because there's no way any kind of memory could survive death because it's all stored in the brain and the brain decays at death. Well, if it's not stored in the brain, that argument doesn't hold anymore. What I'm saying is not that this theory explains survival of bodily death, either through reincarnation, rebirth, heaven and hell, purgatory, the last judgment. There are many different theories, ancestral underworlds, and so on. Uh, the morphic resonance doesn't explain or favor any of those theories, but what it does is leaves the door open for the possibility of survival of bodily death with memories, whereas the conventional theory slams the door and says this is totally impossible. Nothing like this could possibly occur. So, of course, memory damage to the brain can lead to loss of memory, but that doesn't prove the memory is stored there. If I damage your TV set so it can no longer receive certain programs or no longer produce sound, you can still see the pictures. That doesn't prove all the sounds or all the programs you see are created or stored inside the TV set. It simply means you interfered with the reception of it. And so I think brain damage can lead to memory loss, not because it's destroyed the memories, but because it's reduced or destroyed the ability to retrieve them. Now, morphic resonance also has implications for various religious practices. And here, these are points that some of the questions raised. And I have to say, the questions that Dr. Soham passed on to me from the group who had seen my training course were particularly intelligent and interesting questions. And one of them involved religious practices. And I think morphic resonance sheds quite a lot of light on these. If, for example, you have a mantra, then reciting the mantra involves a literal pattern of auditory vibration. That's what sounds are. They're auditory vibrations. It also involves patterns of activity in the brain associated with producing the mantra. Even if you're saying it silently, there's a particular pattern of activity in the brain associated with the silent saying or chanting of the mantra. But exactly because there's this same pattern that's done repeatedly, it means if you use a mantra in meditation, which I do myself, then every time you do it, you're tuning in by morphic resonance to yourself doing it in the past, but you're also tuning into the whole lineage of other people who've used this same mantra. That's one reason I think why in some traditions the mantra is transmitted privately or secretly, and people are advised not to use the mantra in ordinary everyday conversation, but to keep it special, because if you start bandying it around as just a sort of throwing it into ordinary conversations, or even worse, using it as a swear word, then when people use that mantra, it will connect with all those misuses of the mantra in the past and dilute its power. That's why I think all religions have prohibitions on blasphemy, which is the wrong use of holy words. Now, similar things to mantras occur in all religious traditions. I mean, in the Sufi meditative tradition, there are wazifas. In the Christian meditative tradition, there are short prayers or Christian mantras. So these Buddhist meditation can involve mantras. And it's an interesting feature of mantras and indeed of rituals is that they're very conservative. Rituals in religions, like mantras, I think, depend on morphic resonance. And when rituals are carried out, they're carried out as similarly as possible to the way it was done before, with the same words, the same language. And ritual languages are very conservative in the sense that people believe to work, they have to be done in the original form, which is why Brahminic rituals in India are done in Sanskrit for the most part. In the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt, some of the liturgy is in ancient Egyptian. Even in the Western Church, part of the liturgy, the Kyrie eleison, is in Greek from this earliest forms of Christian liturgy. So there's a conservatism in rituals, which I think morphic resonance helps us to understand. When people partake in a ritual today, they are bonded with other people who are doing the same ritual. They're in resonance with those taking part in the same ritual at the same time. But they're also connected across time with all those who've done it before, right back to the first time it happened. And this is why in all religions we find rituals, and in all of them the use of ritual languages, which are often highly conservative. Now, I come to several more points that were raised in the questions before I end. One was about whether ecosystems could have morphic fields, and whether we can use the field of the whole ecosystem to try and bring about ecological recovery. Well, here I'm not quite sure. Morphic fields occur in systems that are compounds rather than mixtures. All of us, when we learned chemistry, learned there's a difference between a mixture and a compound. If you can mix sulfur powder and iron filings together, you've got a mixture of sulfur and iron, and you can have 10 times as much iron as sulfur, or 10 times as much sulfur as iron. But if they combine together to form ferric sulfide or ferrous sulfide, then the proportions are fixed and they're connected as a compound. Now, morphic resonance doesn't apply to mixtures. It doesn't apply to just piles of pebbles or sand. It doesn't apply to houses with bricks all put together. Even though there's an architect's plan, the house is not self-organizing. It doesn't apply to machines or tables or chairs or socks or shirts or computers, which are put together in factories. They're mixtures. They're not governed by an overall self-organizing field. If they were, you'd be able to grow them instead of having to make them in factories with people putting the parts together. Now, with an ecosystem, I'm just not sure to what degree an ecosystem is a unified system with fixed proportions of the different component parts, or to what extent it's a mixture. It would be possible to do experiments on ecological systems. The ones I've been thinking of are in terms of compost, where you have a small amount of organic matter, including perhaps industrial waste, that to be decomposed. You could add an inoculum. You could have a standard inoculum, a whole mixture of fungi and bacteria taken from existing compost heaps or waste dumps. You'd have aliquots of that, lots of identical samples kept in the deep freeze or in the fridge. And then you put one of them with this system to be decomposed, see how fast this mixture of organisms working together could decompose it. Then you do the same thing again with the same starting point and see if it happens faster. And this might show there was a synergistic system-like cooperation of the different organisms, as well as a morphic resonance of individual organisms getting better over time at decomposing the system. There was a question about whether morphic resonance could work through thoughts, feelings, and intentions, and I think it can. If we can affect other people through our actions, anything we do makes it more likely for other people to learn that thing, like riding a bicycle or programming a computer or learning skateboarding or something. Anything we say could add to the morphic resonance of the language and the use of the language and the use of phrases and comprehension of phrases. But anything we think or intend could also affect other people by morphic resonance, just our thoughts um, and our intentions. In all religions, people pray, which is the idea of asking a higher power. All prayers start with an invocation to a god or a goddess or a spiritual being, and then ask them to help with an intention. I'm talking about petitionary prayer, asking for things. And that intention could be have an effect in the world. Prayer is not the same as positive thinking. It depends on divine grace as well as the intention. But intentions, even on their own, can have an effect. Positive thinking is where you can bring about effects through intention. But there's no guarantee that intentions working through morphic resonance will necessarily be good. Morphic resonance has no built-in moral filter. It would reinforce bad habits as well as good habits. So it means there's more importance for us, um, more ethical imperative for us to be careful not only of what we say and do, but of how we think and what our attitudes and our intentions are. Then there were several questions about the relationship of these ideas of morphic resonance to karma siddhant and to samskara, to Indian philosophical ideas about memory and nature. Well, I'm not an expert on Indian philosophy, but it's an inherent feature of Indian philosophy and the philosophies derived from it, like Buddhist and Jain philosophies, that there's a kind of memory in nature. It's not a feature of Western philosophy, typically. It's a very minority view in Western philosophy, which is why morphic resonance is very, very controversial in Western countries. It goes against the Platonic paradigm, the idea that everything eternally fixed, the governing principles of nature, with no memory inherent in nature. But in Indian philosophical systems, it's a much more favorable atmosphere for morphic resonance. It fits very well, I think, with the general principles. Now, I'm sure there are many schools of thought and interpretations of samskara and so on. And some may fit morphic resonance better than others. But I think that what morphic resonance does, it means that these traditional knowledge systems in India, by coming into contact with a testable scientific hypothesis, could actually turn some of those ideas into actual practical science, some of which would actually be practically useful. And morphic resonance fits so naturally with these systems. It seems to me that India would be an ideal place for morphic resonance research, because it fits better than any other traditional system. It's more explicit in Indian thought, this principle of memory in nature. So finally, there was a question or two about creativity. Morphic resonance is basically a habit principle. It leads to repetition. Things stay the same. Patterns of habits don't change much once they're well established, run in grooves of habit, and grooves of habit get deeper by repetition. So this would not lead to evolution by itself. Instead, I think morphic resonance involves evolution involves not only morphic resonance, but a creative principle, which can give rise to new patterns, new forms, new morphic fields. And evolution is an interplay between habit and creativity. Morphic resonance doesn't explain creativity, except insofar as it's a permutation of existing patterns. But for something completely new, you can't explain it just in terms of a repetition of what was there before. So there has to be a creative principle. And whatever theory you have of creative principle, it can be a metaphysical theory, a philosophical theory, a religious theory. Most of these theories of creativity are compatible with morphic resonance. You could say that a Christian God is the creator. You could say that creation comes about through the interplay of, well, a Leela, of just divine creativity and play. You could give a whole range of theories of creativity. But when it comes to the science part, that's for testing the repetition, testing the habit formation, morphic resonance. That part is very testable scientifically. The creative part is not, because science really depends on repetition and things that you could repeatedly observe, whereas creativity, once a creative act has happened for the first time, it can't happen again because it's already happened. You can't predict creativity. So it's not tractable scientifically, but it is a philosophical problem, a valid philosophical and metaphysical problem. But from the point of view of science, I think we have to concentrate more on the habit side than the creativity side. Well, that's a summary of these ideas in which I've tried to include some of the responses to the feedback from your group. And if there are more questions, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Yes, maybe we have time for one or two quick questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. Here in the system, you can raise your hand. Okay, Maitri, you can ask your question. You have raised your hand already.
Thank you so much, sir, for the lecture. I have this question ki when you talked about the E. coli, if we apply the same thing in humans and we talk with respect to disease, so if morphic resonance was to work, won't it just be like ki if a disease was cured in a particular person, it won't happen to the next person or to the next generation if it was cured in a particular person because there would be memory of it. Also, you talked about the fact that it explains how we are resistant to antibiotics. If that is the case, if morphic resonance explains it, how do we stop it? Is there a solution to it? Because for that, the ground law or a theory like morphic resonance would have to stop by itself if we have to like stop the resistance to antibiotics. So how do we explain that? Also, there's one more question. When you talked about carrying it to different lives, uh, the memories, how they get carried on. So, do you think कि in this particular field of research we need to introduce the concepts like subtle body because if a person died, so because if the memory is stored, there has to be a structure. Like in Indian philosophy, we say it is chitta. Do we have to establish that for this theory to work? Because otherwise, though, if a person died, the brain structures and everything died, and how can it get passed on to the next life if there was no storage thing in that?
Well,
Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I think already you have two questions
Huh.
posed. Later, Professor Sheldrake answered to the questions.
okay, well, I'll talk about antibiotics. If morphic resonance is involved in antibiotic resistance, there's not much you can do about it. You can't stop morphic resonance. But being aware of this would make it easier, perhaps, to understand what's going on. I think that morphic resonance may actually play a part in epidemiology, in epidemics. If a lot of people recover from a disease through the the antibody system, the immune response, then it should make it easier for other people to have the same kind of immune response and respond to that disease. This suggests that with respiratory viruses, for example, the disease may be very virulent to start with, and then it may become less and less virulent as time goes on, even without vaccinations, because its morphic resonance is underlying this increased immunity to the disease. This is exactly what happened with Asian flu, and in many ways it's what happened with COVID. Many respiratory diseases, flu and colds, start off virulent and then fade away. And I think that's probably why. Anyway, so the antibiotics can't do much about, at least morphic resonance. I haven't thought of a way in which you could apply it to make them the resistance evolve less. There may be ways of doing it. Nobody's really thought about this. I've only started research on this field myself in the last few months. And as far as I know, no one else is even thinking about it. When it comes to survival of death, morphic resonance doesn't require a store. It's a resonance across time. So it leaps across time from one organism to another. It would be possible for someone to pick up the memory of someone now dead just by direct resonance. However, if there's to be a conscious existence in some kind, what the Tibetans call a bardo, an intermediate realm, then there would need to be some kind of subtle body. And actually, I think that our survival, we already know that we have a subtle body. Maybe not be the same as some religious teachings, but every time we dream, we have a dream body which is different from our physical body lying asleep in bed. Every night, I have a dream body. And when I die, it may be that we can go on dreaming. Our dream body may continue with access to memories. Exactly how that works, I have no idea, but it could possibly happen. And that would then fit with what your question was about, a subtle body that could survive death, still open to memory.
Thank you for the answer. And we have two more hands, and I will not take further hands raised in the interest of time. So, Kunal and Subhash, we will take your questions one by one, and then we will end this webinar in the interest of time. Kunal, you can answer. You can ask your question.
Hi, sir. Thanks a lot for your lecture. And Eckhart Tolle, he talks about this concept called pain memory, pain body, in his book A New Earth. So the collective memory that you've mentioned about, this seems very similar to the pain body that Eckhart Tolle talks about. So have you ever read the concept? Have you exchanged notes with him on that?
No, I haven't. But I think that it makes sense to me that there's a memory not only of good things but bad things, and the collective memory would also include trauma. I think it's interesting, for example, that a lot of animals are instinctively frightened of snakes, even though they've never seen a snake before and haven't learned that snakes are dangerous by personal experience. And I think there's collective aversions and fears that are inherited as well as collective attractions. Whether that's similar to what he's proposing, I don't know, but I haven't discussed this with him, so I don't know exactly if it's the same.
Okay. Next, Subhash, you can ask your question.
Sir Pranam, as per the Indian, good evening. I don't know if you are placed in London, then it will be a good afternoon to you. Sir, I have to give you small background. That is, you touched Indian philosophy partly, and you gave us very enlightening question of this morphic phenomena. We have in India as Vedas, which are said to be the condensed information of the existing universe million of years earlier and at present. And we have been told that this content, what we have in Vedas, it has come through Shruti. Shruti we define in the local terminology by a repetition of verses to the students for a long period of time and engraved into their memory so that they could exactly replicate it to the next generation. Because we didn't had Vedas written as we have today Vedas written in the text. They have been carried by Shruti, that is by the power of remembering these verses. And then after a millennia, items have then been printed, and because there was no printing earlier, and today we have the printed material, we call that these books are Vedas. Now, only my query, it is not a question, because since you believe in that there is a phenomena of morphic, how this phenomena of Shruti, that is just by me for a period of 20 years, 15 years, or 10 years, how exactly I could have written the same verse for next generation and to the generation that is through a millennia, unless there is a morphic existence. Because you yourself said that everything cannot be passed on by inheritance of genes. Do you think this role of morphic phenomenon millennia we have? Thank you very much for time and your beautiful talks. Thank you, Chakravarti.
Hmm. Well, I think that Shruti, the transmission, the oral transmission, is actually fundamental to all human cultures because writing was only invented, what, 5,000 years ago? You know, there are disputes with 6,000, 8,000. Anyway, if humans have been around for, as most scientists think, for modern humans, at least 500,000 years, maybe more, and earlier forms of humans for several million years before that, before the invention of writing, after the development of language, and we don't know when human language first began, um, almost all cultural transmission was through oral transmission, through stories, myths, and the transmission of skills. And some societies, like Australian Aborigines, um, retained a culture with no writing at all for something like 40,000 years, which didn't change very much over these huge long periods of archaeological time. Um, so I think that the ability to transmit culture, which is the distinctive feature of humans, where animals have culture too, but we have a vastly greater development of culture and especially language. This oral transmission of stories and is really the basis of the transmission of human culture, preceding the writing it down. So I think morphic resonance may well have played a part in this transmission uh, because it was done repeatedly over many times and becomes much easier to repeat what's often been repeated than something new or an error. The normative effect of morphic resonance would keep these cultural forms of transmission going with greater accuracy. So I think your point is very relevant, yes.
Yes, it was indeed a very nice point made by Subhash, and I thank him for the question also, and thank Rupert for the brilliant talk and handling the questions and their answers. And I think now we already passed 7, so 1 hour spent on the talk and the questions answers. It was splendid to have a discussion with Rupert here firsthand, to listen to his ideas of morphic resonance and how he is trying to scientifically validate these theories. So very much experimental person he is, and he's also publishing his results time to time. So we can all try to see how the experiment goes and mm, and wait for the results. And I would like to thank Rupert now for being here with us and spending time from his busy schedule to share with us his wisdom and his thoughts and theories. And also, I would like to thank all the participants who are present here today and all those who have previously taken his lecture and given the questions which has formed a part of this today's lecture as well. So with that, I would like to formally conclude today's session, and again, thanks to everyone who had been here present today. Thank you, Rupert.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we can all leave now. Thank you.